There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives in the late 60s that I did not expect and that I cannot fully explain, except to say that it feels less like acquiring new knowledge and more like finally being able to see clearly something that was always there, but that the noise and the speed and the accumulated urgency of the preceding decades made impossible to see with the stillness it requires. My name is George. I am 68 years old, and I want to tell you about the things I understand now that I did not understand at 48. Not as the superior wisdom of someone who has arrived at a destination, but as the honest account of a man who has simply been alive long enough and been through enough to have the particular kind of seeing that experience and loss and the gradual quieting of the ego make possible. I want to say first that 48 was not a time of ignorance. I was a reasonably intelligent and reasonably self-aware man at 48 who had read widely and thought carefully about his life and who believed, with the confidence that middle age tends to produce, that he had a fairly accurate understanding of what mattered and how things worked and what he needed to do to live well. The confidence was not entirely unjustified. I knew things at 48 that were genuinely true and genuinely useful. But I also held, with the same confidence, a set of understandings about life and about myself that were not accurate, and that the subsequent 20 years have revised in ways that have been sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes liberating, and always more interesting than the version I was holding before the revision. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the eldest son of a man who was an engineer and a woman who was a teacher, in a household that valued precision and competence and the specific kind of intelligence that produces measurable results, and I carried those values forward into my adult life and into my career as an architect with a thoroughness that served me well in the professional sense and that cost me things in the personal sense that I am still in the process of understanding. I want to tell you the specific things I understand now that I did not understand at 48, and I want to tell them in the order they seem most important rather than the order they arrived, because the arriving was often out of sequence and the importance only became clear in retrospect. The first thing is about the body and what it is, which sounds like an obvious subject and which I understood at 48 in the obvious way, meaning intellectually, and which I understand now in the way that the body itself teaches when you have been inside one long enough and attentively enough to receive the teaching. At 48, I understood the body as the vehicle, the thing that carried the mind through the world and that required maintenance in the way that a vehicle requires maintenance. And I gave it the maintenance that this understanding required, which was adequate and which was missing the more important understanding, which is that the body is not the vehicle for the experience of life, but is the experience of life itself, that what you feel in your muscles and your breath and your senses and your physical engagement with the world is not the delivery mechanism for living, but is the living, and that the years I spent primarily in my head, primarily in the architectural problems and the professional challenges, and the interior analysis that my formation had prioritized, were years in which I was half present in my own life, because I was giving the physical dimension of it the maintenance attention rather than the primary attention it deserved. I understand now, at 68, that the walk in the morning is not preparation for the day, but is itself the day in one of its best forms, that the physical engagement with the world, the sensation of cold air, and the specific quality of early light, and the feeling of the body moving through space is not a lesser form of experience than the thinking and the analyzing and the problem-solving that I prioritized for decades, but is a fuller form, and that the person who is in his body as well as in his mind is more completely alive than the person who is primarily in his mind using the body as transportation. The second thing I understand now that I did not understand at 48 is about the nature of control and what the pursuit of it actually costs. I was a highly controlling person for most of my adult life, not in the dramatic or abusive sense, but in the pervasive and habitual sense of someone who had decided, without consciously deciding it, that the management of outcomes through sufficient planning and sufficient effort and sufficient attention to every variable was both possible and necessary, and that the alternative, which was the genuine acceptance of uncertainty, was a form of negligence rather than a form of wisdom. My wife Eleanor understood this about me better than I understood it about myself, and she bore it with the patience of a woman who had decided that the controlling was the other side of the same coin as the conscientiousness she had married, and that the full picture of a person requires accepting the whole coin. She said to me once in our early 50s that the energy I spent trying to manage things I could not actually control was the most expensive energy I spent, and that the return on it was approximately zero, and that the things I actually needed to manage were being undernourished by the diversion. She was right, and I did not fully understand she was right until my late 50s, when a project I had managed with exceptional thoroughness failed for reasons that were entirely outside my control, and the failure arrived with the specific clarity of evidence that could not be argued with. The understanding that arrived from that failure was not the nihilistic understanding that nothing can be controlled, and effort is therefore pointless, but the more useful and more accurate understanding that the domain of genuine influence is considerably smaller than I had been assuming, and that the energy spent outside that domain was not just wasted, but was actively harmful because it was generating anxiety without generating any corresponding reduction in the likelihood of the things I was anxious about. The reallocation of that energy to the domain where it could actually do something has been among the most productive changes of my later years. The third thing is about relationships, and specifically about the difference between the relationships I was investing in at 48 and the relationships that I now understand to be the primary wealth of a life. At 48, I was investing primarily in the professional relationships, the colleagues and the clients and the network that constituted the social infrastructure of my working life, and I was investing in those relationships with the specific and largely instrumental attention of someone who understood relationships as components of a professional ecosystem, rather than as the primary human experience they actually are. The personal relationships, the marriage and the friendships and the relationship with my two sons received what remained after the professional ones had been attended to, which was sincere and genuine and insufficient. I understand now that the professional relationships, which felt so significant and so consuming at 48, have largely dissolved in the way that professional relationships dissolve when the professional context that sustained them dissolves, and that the personal relationships, which I underfunded for years, are the ones that have proved to be the actual substance of my life. My sons, who are in their late 30s now, are the people I most want to be with and who have grown into men I genuinely admire and find interesting, and the growing of them was happening during the years when I was frequently somewhere else professionally, and I received it partially, and I have spent years grateful for what I received and aware of what the partial receiving meant. The fourth thing I understand now is about the nature of enough, which is a concept I understood at 48 in the theoretical sense and not at all in the practical one. At 48, I was engaged in the specific and exhausting project of more professional recognition and more financial security and more of the various external markers that my formation had taught me to pursue as the evidence of a life being well managed. And I was engaged in this project with a consistency that prevented me from ever fully inhabiting what I already had, because what I already had was always the current position rather than the destination. The understanding of enough is not the understanding that you should stop growing or stop aspiring or stop working toward things that matter to you. It is the understanding that the present configuration of your life contains things worth receiving as they are rather than as the approach to the better version, and that the person who can receive the present configuration with genuine appreciation rather than with the restless assessment of how it might be improved is living in a way that produces a different and fuller quality of daily experience than the person who cannot. I can receive things now that I could not receive at 48 because I was always moving past them toward what they were supposed to lead to. The morning coffee that I drink slowly and with genuine attention now was being consumed at 48 as the fuel for the day's work rather than as the specific and pleasurable experience it actually is. The conversation with Eleanor that I engage in now as the genuinely interesting exchange between two people who have known each other for 40 years was being had at 48 in the distracted way of someone who was thinking about other things while being present in the technical sense. The difference between these two ways of receiving the same life is the difference between a life that is passing through you and a life that you are actually inside. The fifth thing is about failure, and specifically about the relationship to it that I maintained for the first 4 decades of my adult life, and that I have revised substantially in the years since. At 48, I was a person for whom failure was the primary feared outcome, the thing to be avoided through sufficient competence and sufficient preparation and sufficient management of the variables, and the fear of it was a significant engine of my professional functioning, producing a quality of thoroughness that served the work and a quality of anxiety that did not serve the person doing the work. What I understand now is that the failures I experienced across my adult life were not the interruptions to the life, but were in most cases the events that produced the most significant growth. That the architectural project that failed in my 50s taught me more about my own assumptions and limitations than 30 years of successful projects, and that the willingness to be in genuine relationship with failure rather than in constant defensive preparation against it is one of the conditions of a genuinely engaged life rather than one of its risks. The sixth thing, and the one I want to say last because I think it is the most fundamental of the revisions, is about what I am. At 48, I understood what I am primarily through my roles and my accomplishments and the various external definitions that a professional and social life accumulates and that can feel from inside them like the description of the actual person rather than the description of what the person does. I was an architect and a husband and a father and a partner and a colleague and the various other role-based definitions that a life at its midpoint generates, and I had not yet had the experiences or the losses or the stripping away of the professional infrastructure that eventually made clear what remained when the roles were reduced. What I understand now is that what I am is something considerably simpler and considerably more durable than the role-based understanding suggested, something that was there before the roles were established and that will be there when most of them have passed, something that I would describe not as a self-concept, but as a presence, a quality of awareness and experience and engagement with the world that is mine in a way the roles were never quite mine, that does not depend on performance or external validation or the continuation of any particular set of circumstances to exist. I am 68 years old, Eleanor is 65, and we are in the best period of our marriage. My sons are men I am proud of for specific and genuine reasons. The architectural work I still do, part-time and by choice, is better than it has ever been, because I am doing it from a different place than I was doing it from at 48, a place where the work is the expression of something rather than the justification for something, and the expression is both freer and more interesting than the justification was. I wish I had understood these things at 48. I understand that the understanding at 48 would not have been possible in the form it has arrived at 68, because the form requires the 20 years and the things those years contained. And I am not arguing against the necessity of the journey, but offering the destination as clearly as I can so that you can orient toward it earlier and perhaps arrive with more of your life remaining to live from it. You are already on the way. The understanding comes. Let it come. And when it does, receive it with both hands and change the things it tells you to change. There is still time. At 68, I am certain there is still time.